shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. Hello, this is Ben Anderton, and today I want to talk about the impact of Jesus music on modern Christianity. That song right there was one of the oldies from the 1970s that was done by the Maranatha Praise Team. And today I want to talk about the foundation of Jesus music and then the impact that it has in church today. Martin Luther once said, "It is not my view that the gospel should cause all the arts to be struck down and disappear. On the contrary, I should like to see all the arts, and especially music, used in the service of Him who gave and created them." The 1960s in the United States was an era of turmoil. There was a hippie movement, Vietnam War. There was a lot of strife in our nation over many different issues. And out of the midst of that came a guy named Chuck Smith out in Southern California who had come out of the Foursquare Church, started by Amy Semple McPherson. And he started a church that he called Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa. Now, it was a man in 1965, 1966 named Lonnie Frisbee, who was a hippie who came to Christ under Chuck Smith's ministry. And these two worked in tandem at bringing in a new type of parishioner to their church, hippies. Now, Lonnie Frisbee was well connected with musicians. And when many of these young musicians started coming to Christ, they started writing new songs, and Chuck Smith, who was the pastor, the teacher in that church, would allow these young musicians to step forward at the end of services or before and sing the songs that they had written to the Lord. This was really the beginning of what we call Jesus music and the beginning of the overall Jesus movement. Ken Gullickson and John Wimber came out of that. They should be taken note of because really they started what is called the Vineyard movement. And between Calvary Chapel and Vineyard, you really had the foundation of what we now call contemporary Christian music, CCM. When we're talking about contemporary Christian music, especially the early Jesus music, there's really a few that stand out as being foundational to what transpired. The very first contemporary Christian band was called Love Song. They included guys like Chuck Girard. For a short time, Phil Keaggy was on Love Song. And Phil Keaggy is still today considered one of the best guitarists in the world. But they started in 1965, 1966, very early in the Jesus movement, started to put out songs and do concerts, and they became very big in the Christian community, in the young Christian community of the day. Another person that we should note is Keith Green. Keith Green had an astounding effect on Christian music and on church in America and worldwide. Again, his impact was felt. He only put out 4 Christian albums over the span of like 5 years before he died at the age of 28 in a plane crash. His life was cut short, but he had some phenomenal songs in an amazing ministry that still lives on. There's a ministry he started in Texas called Last Days Ministries. And some of his songs today that we would still recognize, "There is a Redeemer," "Create in Me a Clean Heart." Many of these songs we still sing today in many of our church services, and we hear them on the radio. Another popular group in the Christian world at this time was the Second Chapter of Acts. They were a trio, one brother and 2 sisters, who had a huge impact on the Christian world, Christian music world, and on Jesus music. We mentioned Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard, and the original band that was directly associated with Calvary Chapel was just called the Praise Band. They are now called Maranatha Singers, and that song that I started off this presentation with was one of the original songs off of, I believe, the third Praise album that was put out by the Praise Band. A couple other guys that we should mention that came along later, aside from Keith Green, who we already discussed, is Michael Card and Don Francisco. And some of these guys, you might not necessarily recognize their names if you're of the younger generation at this point, but they really had some songs that changed the scope of American church music. Don Francisco had a song called He's Alive that is still one of the most popular Easter songs of the day. And Michael Card, probably his most popular song was one called El Shaddai. So all of these, they built upon each other over those 10, 15-year generations of music to change the music across America. Now, when we talk about Christian rock, there's one name that constantly pops up as the father of Christian rock, and that is Larry Norman. If you are a fan of 70s and early 80s classic rock music, then you would probably be a fan of Larry Norman's music. Starting in 1969, Larry Norman started a ministry of Christian rock music that really changed the face of Christian music. We had the contemporary Christian, what turned into that, but Larry Norman was different. He used a lot more, just a heavier guitar sound, driving drums in his songs, and they were very different. So he's known as the father of Christian rock and really kind of gave birth to other famous rock groups like Petra, which were very impactful during the 80s in church music. They really led up to like bands such as today we have Skillet, and through the 90s and even some today we have DC Talk and Newsboys, that we would kind of consider those Christian rock type groups. As far as the contemporary Christian side of things, if you didn't have groups like Love Song and Second Chapter of Acts and the Praise Singers, you wouldn't necessarily have today. You could compare those to Hillsong or Bethel music, guys like Matt Redman, Chris Tomlin, and Matthew West. So we see how it's just transpired over really the past 50 or 60 years, since 1965 to 1966, right in that time frame, to what it is today. Now we have to ask the question, how has this changed church? Well, starting off, it really gave birth to a big movement in non-denominational churches. As mentioned, Calvary Chapel and then Vineyard really were the foundation of Jesus music, where that came out of. And from there, we have all kinds of different, we mentioned Hillsong, there's so many non-denominational movements taking place, not just in America, but around the world. It's changed worldwide, global church singing and music. So we see these differences, and then we have to ask, well, what does it mean? Remember, back before 1965, it was really just traditional hymns, and then gospel music was around at that time. So this really deviated from that, and even still today in many traditional churches, they have not yet moved to a contemporary side of things. Now, I personally love many of the old hymns, and I think they have a glorious message to them. But I also appreciate, starting in the 60s with the Jesus music, what it's meant for our society and for church today. As Martin Luther stated about the importance of music and not suppressing it, we really need to be, I think, the same way in looking at what we do. And in everything, what we're seeing, does it glorify our Savior? If it's not glorifying Jesus, then we should have a question about it. What is the music conveying about who we are? What is the message that we are putting out, not just to each other singing in a worship service, but to the world as they hear this message? I hope that's given you a kind of an overview of the brief history of the impact of Jesus music on modern Christianity. And next time you sit down in maybe a more modern church service setting, you'll think about a little bit of this and really how in just a short time frame the church has changed from the 1960s until today.